All right, thanks, Kimberly. Let's make sure I can get my screen shared just real quick. All right, how we looking? Cool. Okay, well, thanks for inviting me to talk today, folks at freeCodeCamp, Oklahoma. I'm going to try to give a little bit of a speculative talk where I talk about where the web has been, and more importantly, where some developer communities think that the web is headed. So I'm calling this Re-Decentralizing the Web, Web3, D-Web, and the web's better futures. So I'm Daniel Helm. I'm the developer evangelist for Skynet Labs. We are a small team that is kind of working on a bunch of these technologies that I'll be talking about today, especially decentralized storage. But in terms of my Oklahoma cred, I was born in Tulsa, went to school a couple of times at OU, and now have lived in Oklahoma City for over a decade. Prior to working at Skynet Labs, I have a pretty varied background, most recently getting my Master of Fine Arts at the University of Oklahoma, where I was in their Art, Technology, and Culture department, teaching and making lots of artwork that involved writing software to try to visually consider data and algorithms. And before that, I kind of worked a lot in web development, digital media production, and those spaces. But to start the talk, a tweet. It's not just you. The internet has gotten significantly worse in virtually every respect. Okay, so there's some grumbling to be done about the internet today as we experience it, right? I could pull everyone on the Twitch stream and get, a good sampling of what's gone wrong from the user perspective. Maybe Google has prioritized profits over user experience or dropped your favorite project. Maybe there's this overwhelming presence of clickbait, targeted algorithms. And I think most importantly, there's no way of escaping the pull of certain platforms, right? You join some sort of Facebook group, and if you ever want to leave Facebook, you can't bring that data with you. You can't migrate your Twitter contacts to your Facebook or vice versa unless they're going to let you do that. And so there's this real kind of pull and heaviness to getting attached to platforms in that way. So in this talk, we're going to talk about one strain of thought about kind of what a lot of folks think is wrong with this vision of the web. All right, and this is it here. Well, this is a diagram representing the idea, but the idea is centralization, right? We have a single central authority, and then all these nodes on the network are reliant on it. And this is what most of the web looks like today. A small handful of very powerful corporations control the vast majority of how we experience the web. And so there's problems that we see coming along with that. And so we can look at this kind of idea of the traditional web and start to kind of assess some of these. And the web's not this monolithic. In the early days, it was a little bit more Wild West and decentralized in its own right. But what we kind of see today is we see a lot of centrally managed infrastructure, right? So this is both the functionality and the ownership over this infrastructure is centrally managed. Also, we have all of our data and application logic that is, separated into silos. All my Facebook data is over here, all my Twitter data is over here, and I can't just bring them back and forth or take them to another app freely and openly. I have to almost get consent from the Facebook operators. The next kind of thing we see is that users and developers have to really have a blind trust in either their application provider or their service provider. And lastly, we have I call this server-sided funding, but the financial burden is on the person that's doing this kind of sending of the data, doing the storing, creating the application. And so, that stuff costs a lot of money. So we as users then have to kind of have it in the back of our head, like, how is this stuff getting funded? And so I've listed out a few of the things that happens here. With centrally managed infrastructure, we see censorship, deplatforming. You don't really necessarily have ownership over a bunch of this stuff. With silos, we get vendor lock-in, no interoperability, so you can't take the Facebook stuff to Twitter. With blind trust, it's this kind of like one central location, and if the security of that fails, you have 50,000 people with their passwords leaked, not just one. And the last one is that if you're a startup, you might be scared of really going viral one night because that means you have to start covering your infrastructure costs as they are rapidly increasing. And you might not have already figured out a way to monetize that. And the temptation is typically to run with monetizing your users, right? All right, so that's kind of my ploy for pitch for what's wrong with the internet. Here is a pitch for how we can fix it, and it is the idea here of decentralization. And so here we have all these nodes that are, interdependent on one another, and there's no real central authority that's governing what's happening. To be clear, not only are these things distributed, spread out, but they're also decentralized. And so that's this idea of there's not this central authority really controlling the behavior or the interactions of any of these machines. And so we can view these kind of side by side to get another comparison for this. And the idea is really that as we pioneer technologies and protocols that kind of incorporate this style on the right, this decentralized protocols, we really allow for some resilient structures that don't have to rely on the central authority. And so what we get is this idea of the decentralized web. And so we can have distributed storage that is able to really distribute and encrypt all this content. We have censorship resistance that can get built into that. We have real data ownership where the user owns their data and is able to take it to whatever application they please. And lastly, we can create more flexible marketplaces where the kind of like traditional selling of the user and their attention is not necessarily the only way for economic incentives to happen. So, and it's not the only way for creators to get paid too, which is a really important aspect of that. One way we can kind of view this, view decentralization is here I've got two maps. The top showing Amazon's web data centers, AWS facilities. And so we have a handful, spread across the globe. They're distributed. But then the graph at the bottom here, I have the, all the cities that my company Skynet in the last year has had, visitors using our service. And you can just kind of like look at one and then the other and really get the sense that, yeah, if you can harness the, power of all of these machines all spread out, you really are going to have a much more resilient structure than the top one. So I've been pretty vague and I don't know, kind of high level decentralization. Well, what can we decentralize? There's all sorts of things we can look at. You can look at storage, and that's what Skynet does a lot of. You might have heard of IPFS or Arweave. We can also decentralize identity, so it's not just like Google has to say who I am, but the user gets to say, well, I have some proof of who I am, and I get to maintain, and I can have ways to prove that to you. There's also communications that we can decentralize, and I've listed a few there, BitTorrent probably being one of the most popular ones. We can also decentralize the idea of domain names, databases, which a lot of blockchain projects are kind of in that space. Computation, you might have heard of smart contracts on blockchains. Messaging, source control, the list goes on. And all these projects, usually don't even fall into one little neat category like this or anything, but really there's a whole new kind of vision of the web and ecosystem of these things that are interdependent on one another that is really a powerful way forward for re-envisioning how we communicate with one another and how we can build technologies. So the big question, what can we call it? A lot of projects are calling it Web 3. A lot of other ones call it DWeb. Web 3 is often used by Ethereum and Polkadot, two blockchain networks. And DWeb just stands for the decentralized web. And this is a lot broader and applies to a wider range of decentralized technologies. So if you're interested, I have a little bit of a call to action here. I would be super excited if you'd check out the Internet Archive's DWeb project and meetup. They also have published a list of principles as to what they think the future of the internet should be and look like, and they're very human-centric. And I think they've done a really good job at encapsulating, I think, the virtues of the internet. So check that out at getdweb.net. And my other call to action here is if you're interested in thinking about what it looks like to use this decentralized applications or what new use cases they could have, I'd encourage you to check out Skynet's upcoming Use-a-thon. It's a hackathon where you get to try web apps that are building on these technologies and are trying to build a better web today. And so we'll have lots of awards for people that just both use the applications and also come up with ideas for new applications that build on top of these. And that'll be hosted on Gitcoin, so you can take a look at that there. All right, well, thank you so much for your time, and let me know what questions I can answer.